Among 40 new hires scrambling to make an impression on their first week, only one person, a quiet woman in a second-hand blazer, stopped in the middle of a busy hospital corridor to ask the janitor if he needed help carrying the mop bucket up the stairs. She didn't know she was talking to the man who owned the building. Nobody did. That was the point. His name was James Whitaker. At 41, he was the founder and majority shareholder of Whitaker Health Group, a private hospital network with 4 facilities across Ontario and a 5th under construction in Calgary. He had been featured in Report on Business twice and quoted in the Globe once on the subject of patient-centered care. There was a framed photograph of him in the main lobby of Ridgemont General, shaking hands with the Ontario Minister of Health at the ribbon-cutting ceremony 3 years prior. That photograph was the only reason he wore the cap. It had been the suggestion of his operations director, a practical woman named Sandra, who had spent 20 years fixing problems in organizations before people admitted the problems existed. When James had told her he intended to spend a week working as a facilities aide at Ridgemont General, the very hospital where concerns about staff treatment had begun surfacing in anonymous culture surveys, Sandra had looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has just announced they are going to walk to Vancouver. "At least wear a cap," she had said, "and glasses, and maybe don't stand directly under your own portrait." So he wore a blue cap and a pair of wire-framed glasses he had bought at a Shoppers Drug Mart on Bloor Street, and he arrived at Ridgemont General at 6:15 on a Monday morning under the name James Ford, facilities aide, temporary reassignment from the Scarborough location. No one looked at him twice. He had expected to feel something dramatic, walking into the hospital as a different version of himself. Instead, he felt the particular invisibility that came with a gray uniform and a mop cart. Staff moved around him in the corridor, the way water moves around a stone, not with hostility, just with the quiet, efficient indifference of people who had learned which presences required acknowledgement and which did not. He understood then, within the first 20 minutes, what the surveys had been trying to tell him. The surveys had arrived on his desk 6 weeks earlier, compiled by a third-party firm he had hired to assess employee satisfaction across all 4 facilities. Ridgemont General, the flagship location, had returned numbers that looked fine on the surface. Engagement, moderate. Retention, acceptable. Satisfaction, average. But buried in the qualitative responses, the open text fields that most executives skimmed or skipped entirely, were sentences that had stayed with James through 2 weekends and a flight to Calgary and back. "Nobody above a charge nurse has ever learned my name. I reported a problem to HR 8 months ago. I was told it had been addressed. Nothing changed. You feel it after a while. Like certain people are allowed to matter and certain people are not." That last one had been written by someone in housekeeping. James had read it 4 times. The chief operating officer was a man named Jeffrey Crane. Jeffrey was 53, well-dressed in the particular way of people who consider appearance a form of professional argument, and deeply skilled at presenting data in the most comfortable possible frame. When James had raised the survey responses in their last meeting, Jeffrey had nodded with practiced concern. "Isolated voices," Jeffrey had said. "You'll always have a certain percentage of dissatisfied employees in any large organization. What matters is the trend line, and the trend line is stable." James had looked at the trend line. It was stable in the same way a flat line was stable. So now he was here, at 6:15 in the morning, pushing a mop cart past the surgical prep area, while a charge nurse told a junior nurse to stop standing around and get the linen order sorted, and the junior nurse disappeared without a word. The first thing he noticed was the coffee cups. Not the medical equipment, not the administrative systems, not the budget allocations, the coffee cups. They were everywhere. On window ledges, on the edge of nursing stations, on top of filing cabinets, balanced on chairs in the break rooms. And every single one of them had been left for someone else to deal with, not maliciously. Just as a quiet daily declaration that certain tasks belonged to certain people, and certain people did not need to be thanked for performing them. By 10 o'clock, James had been spoken to directly 3 times. Once by a porter who needed help shifting a supply cart. Once by a woman from dietary who asked if he'd finished the 3rd-floor staff lounge yet. And once by someone in scrubs who said, "Hey," and pointed at a spill near the elevator without breaking stride. He was wiping down the volunteer reception desk near the main entrance when the new nursing cohort arrived. There were 14 of them. They came through the main doors in a loose group, most of them carrying coffee from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away, wearing lanyards and the careful expressions of people who were trying to look like they already belonged somewhere they had never been. A hospital administrator named Sylvia Tremblay, no relation to the Lena Tremblay in his HR files, just a coincidence of surnames, was guiding them toward the conference room on the second floor where their orientation was scheduled to begin. James kept wiping the desk. He watched them the way he had learned to watch things this week, without appearing to. Most of them did not see him at all. A young man in a pressed shirt walked directly through the area James had just cleaned, leaving a trail of wet shoe prints, and did not look down. A woman with a leather portfolio pressed to her chest swerved to avoid the cart, and then glanced back with a look that suggested the cart had been positioned inconsiderately. Then one of them stopped. She was somewhere in her late 20s, wearing dark trousers and a blazer that had seen better days, but had been pressed carefully regardless. She was carrying a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a coffee in her hand, and she had stopped because James was trying to maneuver the mop cart through a doorway that was slightly too narrow, and the cart had jammed. "Here," she said, and set her coffee down on the reception desk. Not on his cart, not on the floor, on the desk, out of his way, and held the door open with her shoulder so he could angle the cart through. "Thank you," James said. "Do you need a hand with the rest of it?" She looked at the cart, at the bucket, at the squeeze mechanism that had been sticking since Thursday. "That wringer looks like it's given up. It has its moments." She smiled at that, not the polite performative smile that people offered service workers when they wanted credit for having noticed them. Just a real one, a little tired, slightly crooked. "I'm Noah," she said. "First day." "James, is it always this busy this early?" "Boozier," he said. "You picked a light Monday." Someone from the group called her name from down the hall. She picked up her coffee, gave him a small nod, and went. James stood in the doorway for a moment with the cart. Her name tag had read Noah Arsenault, nursing cohort, Dalhousie University. Halifax then or thereabouts, a long way from home for a first placement. He pushed the cart toward the service elevator and pressed the button for the third floor. By Tuesday afternoon, James had mapped the shape of the problem with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years studying systems. It was not one thing. It was never one thing. It was 100 small permissions, each one so minor that no individual act could be prosecuted, but together they had built something. A culture in which certain people were allowed to be invisible, and certain people had learned to be comfortable with that invisibility. The facility's staff ate lunch in a room that shared a wall with the loading dock. The noise from deliveries made conversation difficult. There was a staff lounge on the second floor with comfortable chairs and a proper espresso machine that had been installed during a renovation 2 years ago. James had approved that budget himself, but the facilities and dietary staff did not use it. Not because anyone had told them not to, because the unspoken architecture of the building had made it clear, over time, that the room was not for them. He found this out from a man named Earl, 67 years old, who had worked in housekeeping at Ridgemont General for 22 years, and who brought his own thermos every day because the coffee in the facilities room tasted, in Earl's words, like it was brewed by someone who read about coffee in a brochure once. Earl was the kind of person that large organizations could not function without, and rarely acknowledged. He knew where every circuit breaker panel was located in the building. He knew which freight elevator door stuck if you let it close too fast. He had, on 3 separate occasions that he mentioned without any particular pride, identified maintenance issues that would have become serious structural problems if left unaddressed. His formal title was Housekeeping Attendant Level 2. His informal title, in the unwritten ledger of the building, was closer to institutional memory. James found him Wednesday morning, working alone on the 4th floor. "You're from Scarborough," Earl said, not as a question. He had a way of sizing up new people that came from 2 decades of watching them arrive and leave. "That's right. Different over there?" "In some ways." Earl made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism. "They all say that. New people. Different over there. Give it a month." James asked him about the complaint process, how it worked, whether people used it. Earl looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has explained a simple truth many times to people who were surprised by it. "There's a form," he said, "digital now. You fill it in, you get an automated response that says it's been received. Then one of 2 things happens. Either nothing, or you get called into a meeting where someone from HR explains to you why the thing you observed isn't actually what you observed. He paused. I filed something last spring about the schedule changes. Staff kept getting their shifts rearranged with 48 hours notice. You can't arrange childcare with 48 hours notice. What happened? The policy was reviewed, Earl said, in a tone that made clear what the review had concluded. James said nothing. He had seen the policy. He had approved it as part of a broader efficiency restructuring 18 months ago. He had not thought about what 48 hours looked like from the other end. The nursing cohort's first major assessment was a case study presentation due Friday on patient flow and discharge delays. A real problem at Ridgemont that James had been trying to solve at the executive level for 2 years. The teams were assigned on Wednesday. A young man named Preston Webb was on the list. A young man named Carter Flynn was appointed to lead Noah Arsenault's group by Sylvia Tremblay, with the kind of casual authority that assumed certain people were natural coordinators and others were natural contributors. Carter Flynn had graduated from the University of Toronto, had completed a placement at a hospital in Boston, and possessed the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional so often that he had stopped questioning it. He was not cruel. That was the important thing to understand about people like Carter. Cruelty requires intention. What Carter had instead was a smooth, ambient self-centeredness that had never been challenged by circumstance. James watched them through the glass of the family lounge, where he was replacing a light fixture. Or rather, he watched the reflected shapes of them, the way the overhead fluorescence turned the window into a partial mirror. On Thursday morning, he found Noah in the stairwell between the second and third floors, sitting on a concrete step with a printed spreadsheet on her knee, and an expression that people wore when they had been trying very hard not to feel something, and had just stopped succeeding. He had come up the stairs to avoid the freight elevator, which was occupied. He almost turned around. "I'm not having a breakdown," Noah said, without looking up. "I just needed 2 minutes away from a room where every sentence starts with, 'what we should do.'" James leaned against the wall. He was still carrying the toolkit from the light fixture job. "What happened?" She looked at the spreadsheet. "I spent 2 nights building out the analysis for our presentation. Discharge bottlenecks, admission staging, the handoff problems between nursing and transport. Real patterns. I talked to 4 nurses on the floor and 2 people in patient transport who knew exactly where the delays were coming from." She folded the paper once, very precisely along a crease that was already there. "This morning Carter restructured the whole document. My name is in the acknowledgments now." "The acknowledgments." James said nothing. "He didn't even tell me he was going to do it," she said. "I found out when the updated version appeared in the shared folder at 6:50 in the morning. I've been here since 7, and he has said approximately nothing." "What are you going to do?" She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her face that he recognized. Not from this week, but from before it, from his own life, from the period in his early 30s when he had worked under a man who had a gift for making other people's ideas sound like his own generous summaries of the obvious. "I don't know," Noah said. "If I say something, I'm difficult. If I don't say something, I'm compliant, and apparently compliant is what this place rewards." She paused. "You've been here longer than me. Is it always like this?" James looked at the narrow window in the stairwell wall. Outside, the October sky over Toronto was the particular flat gray that meant rain before noon. "No," he said, "but it's been like this long enough that people have stopped expecting otherwise." She studied him for a moment. He was aware of it. The way she looked at people, the way she had looked at the mop cart wringer, with the quiet attention of someone trying to understand how a thing actually worked. "You talk like someone who used to be in charge of something," she said. James adjusted the toolkit in his hand. "I've worked in a lot of different rooms," he said carefully. "You learn things about how decisions get made. And what did you learn?" He thought about Earl's thermos. He thought about the anonymous line in the survey. "You feel it after a while. Like certain people are allowed to matter and certain people are not. That the people who understand the work best are almost never the ones explaining it to the people making decisions about it," he said. "And that tends to go on until someone decides to close that distance." Noah looked at him for another moment, then nodded once, as if she had filed the sentence somewhere and would return to it later. "I should go back," she said. "The presentation's tomorrow, and someone should make sure the actual data is still in there somewhere." She went back up the stairs. James stayed in the stairwell for a moment, then descended toward the basement. He reviewed the shared folder from a terminal in the security office that night, after the day shift had cleared out. The original document was still in the version history. Noah Arsenault's analysis, the bottleneck mapping, the transport delay data, the floor-level observations from the nurses she had interviewed, was visible in the draft from 48 hours ago, attributed clearly. In the current version, the same analysis appeared under a heading called Strategic Flow Assessment, with Carter Flynn's name at the top and Noah's move to a line that read Research Support. Arsenault. He pulled 3 more files before he closed the terminal. The first was Jeffrey Crane's internal notes from the Culture Survey review. One paragraph read, "Housekeeping and dietary responses skew negative as expected given the demographic, not indicative of systemic issue, recommend no escalation." The second was an HR record, Earl's complaint about the scheduling policy, marked, reviewed, no action required, file closed. The third was a message thread between Jeffrey Crane and Sylvia Tremblay from 2 weeks ago, discussing the nursing cohort assessments. One line read, "Carter Flynn is exactly the profile we're trying to build. Would be good to give him a visible win early." James stared at that line for a long time. He thought about the word win, what it meant in a building where the work was keeping people alive. He thought about what it cost, who it cost, to give someone a visible win in a system where visibility was finite and unevenly distributed. He closed the files and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the building settle around him. Friday morning was bright, cold, and professionally pleasant in the particular way of institutions that had learned to perform warmth. The boardroom on the 6th floor had been set with coffee service and printed agendas, and Jeffrey Crane sat at the head of the table with the composed expression of a man who had attended many presentations and found most of them satisfying. The cohort presentations were scheduled for 10 o'clock. James arrived at 9:50 with a cleaning cart and began wiping down the side credenza. No one acknowledged him. Carter Flynn presented first. His slides were polished, his language was confident, and his analysis, Noah's analysis, repackaged in boardroom vocabulary, landed well. Jeffrey nodded. Sylvia smiled. One of the board observers said solid under his breath and wrote something on his notepad. "Walk us through the transport delay piece," said a board member named Dr. Reginald Asseri. "Where did that data come from specifically?" Carter paused for a fraction of a second. "We pulled from floor-level observations and patient transport records. The team did a thorough review." "Which team member worked the floor observations?" Another fraction of a second. "It was a collaborative process." Dr. Assara looked at the room. He was 70 years old and had practiced internal medicine at Ridgemont General for 3 decades before joining the board. He had a way of waiting for people to continue speaking that made continuing difficult. Noah was sitting in the second row. James saw her hands folded in her lap, the knuckles not quite white. She had not slept. He could see that from across the room. She had come in anyway. He thought about what he had told her in the stairwell, about closing the distance. Then she stood up. "The floor observations were mine," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are being held very deliberately. "I spoke with 4 RNs on the medical floor and 2 members of patient at transport over 2 days. The bottleneck pattern in the presentation, the handoff delays between discharge orders and transport scheduling that came from those conversations." Carter turned to look at her. The room shifted. "Noah contributed important field research," he said evenly. "I consolidated it into the strategic framework." "The strategic framework is the field research," Noah said, reframed. The room was quiet in a way that had texture. Jeffrey Crane leaned forward. "I think what we're seeing here is a natural. Let her finish." James said it from the side of the room. He had not planned to. Or rather, he had planned to wait, to let the week complete itself, to make the revelation in a more controlled setting, to be strategic about it the way he had been strategic about most things for most of his career. But he had spent a week watching decency get quietly penalized in the institution he owned, and he was finished being strategic about it. Everyone turned. Jeffrey Crane's face arranged itself into the expression of a man encountering a minor administrative irregularity. "Ford, you need to step out." James removed the cap. He set it on the credenza beside the coffee service. He took off the glasses and placed them next to the cap. Then he looked at Jeffrey Crane and said, "My name is not Ford." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It had weight. Jeffrey's face did not drain of color so much as reorganize itself. The way a building looks in the seconds after something structural has shifted. I've spent this week as a facilities aide, James said. Because 6 weeks ago, I received culture survey results that told me, in the language that people use when they believe no one is listening, that this hospital had stopped being able to see itself clearly. I wanted to see it myself. He looked at Jeffrey. Earl in housekeeping filed a scheduling complaint 10 months ago. It was marked no action required and closed. His team still gets 48-hour notice for shift changes. Many of them have children. He looked at Sylvia. The facility staff eat lunch next to the loading dock because the unspoken rules of this building have convinced them that the second-floor lounge isn't for them. We put a $1,200 espresso machine in that lounge 2 years ago. The people who most need a break during a 12-hour shift are eating their lunch to the sound of a refrigerated truck. He looked at Jeffrey again. And I have a message thread in which you and Sylvia discussed positioning Carter Flynn for a visible win before his cohort assessment, which would be a reasonable thing to want, except that the win was built on analysis conducted by someone else, and the decision to reassign that credit had already been made before the presentation happened. Carter Flynn was very still. Jeffrey opened his mouth. I'm not finished, James said. He turned to Dr. Asari. I'd like Noah Arsenault to complete the presentation. Dr. Asari looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. Noah stood at the front of the room for one breath with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then she walked to the presentation screen, took the remote, and went back to slide 3. The one with her original mapping on it, the one Carter had relabeled. Her voice shook once, at the beginning of the second sentence. Then it didn't. She explained what she had found, the discharge order bottleneck, the gap between nursing sign-off and transport notification. An average of 47 minutes that existed not because of staff failure, but because the two systems used to communicate between departments had never been integrated, and no one with the authority to fix it had ever been close enough to the problem to feel its weight. She explained what a pilot fix might look like. She had numbers. She had names. Real names. The nurses and transport staff who had given her their time and their honest assessment of where the system was breaking down. When she finished, Dr. Asare said, "How long did it take you to build that analysis?" 2 evenings, Noah said, and about 6 hours on the floor. Have you worked in hospital administration before? No, I worked in a grocery distribution warehouse for 2 years before nursing school. The handoff problems looked familiar. Dr. Asare looked at James. Something passed between them, two people who had spent enough time in institutions to know what it meant when someone close to the work turned out to understand it better than the people explaining it. Ridgemont General did not transform itself in a week. James had been running organizations long enough to know that announcements were not change, and that the gap between a policy revision and a cultural shift was measured in years, not memos. But some things changed immediately because they could. The second-floor lounge was open to all staff. Not announced with fanfare, just opened, the informal understanding dissolved by a quiet word from facilities management that the room was for everyone. Within 3 days, Earl had tried the espresso machine and declared it acceptable. The scheduling policy was revised. Minimum 2 weeks' notice for shift changes except in documented emergencies. James had read the original policy again, carefully, before signing the revision. He thought about what it was like to arrange childcare with 48 hours. He thought about how many decisions he had approved without thinking about what they felt like from the other end. Jeffrey Crane resigned before the formal investigation concluded. He sent James a letter that was mostly about his own distinguished service record. James read it, set it aside, and did not respond. Sylvia Tremblay remained, on the condition that she complete a structured review process and that a new cohort assessment framework be developed with input from clinical and support staff across all departments, not just the ones that showed up in the talent pipeline reports. Carter Flynn was removed from the leadership track. He was not dismissed. He was given the option to continue his placement under standard terms. He took it, and for the remaining 6 weeks of his rotation he was quieter, and occasionally, when he thought no one important was watching, James heard he was also more useful. Noah Arsenault was offered a position on the patient flow optimization pilot, a real role, not a courtesy title, with a salary that reflected the actual scope of the work. She negotiated the offer herself. James was not in the room, he had made sure of that. Earl was invited to join an operational working group that James convened on the third Friday after the presentation. A meeting with no fixed agenda, other than to ask the people who were closest to the daily work of the hospital what they saw that the people in the sixth-floor boardroom were missing. Earl arrived with his thermos and a handwritten list of 11 items, numbered and specific, that he had evidently been keeping for some time. James read the list twice. Then he told Earl he would follow up on each item and report back within 30 days, and he meant it, and Earl looked at him with the particular expression of someone deciding whether or not to believe a thing they have wanted to believe for a long time. "You're not much like the other executives I've met," Earl said. "I've been told," James said. "They don't usually fix the wringer on the mop cart before they leave." James had, in fact, fixed the wringer on the mop cart. It had taken him 40 minutes on Thursday afternoon, and the satisfaction of it had surprised him. It was sticking, he said. Earl nodded as if this explained something more than the mop cart. It was 3 months later, on a Tuesday evening, when James ran into Noah Arsenault in the corridor outside the Patient Flow Project office. He was there for a late budget review. She was leaving after what looked, from the stack of folders under her arm, like a very long day. They both stopped. "How's the pilot?" he said. 41% reduction in discharge to transport lag in the first 6 weeks, she said. "We're presenting to the Calgary team next month." "I heard," he said. "It's good work." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the way she did it that reminded him of the stairwell, the careful attention, the sense that she was measuring not just what was said but what was underneath it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes, that first morning, when I helped with the mop cart." She paused. "Did you know then?" James thought about it honestly. "I knew you were different from the rest of them," he said. "I didn't know yet what that would mean." She nodded slowly. "I didn't stop because I thought it would help my career," she said. The wringer was broken and you were struggling with it and it seemed like the obvious thing to do." "I know," James said. "That's exactly why it mattered." Outside the window at the end of the corridor, November had settled over the city. The streetlights were coming on along the street below, and the first real cold of the season was pressing itself against the glass. Neither of them moved toward the elevator. "There's a decent coffee place 2 blocks down," Noah said carefully, "if you were heading that way." James looked at the budget report under his arm. He looked at the corridor, and the elevator, and the window with the darkening street outside. "I was," he said. They walked out of the building together, and the automatic doors closed behind them, and the night was cold and ordinary, and nothing like an ending.